I dropped the award certificate into a kitchen drawer and pushed it beneath a stack of old magazines before anyone could see it. My mother was preparing dinner, my father was reading the newspaper, and my younger siblings were arguing about whose turn it was to wash the dishes. Nobody noticed what I had done. As I stood there with my hand resting on the drawer, a strange feeling settled over me. The certificate represented years of hard work, yet hiding it felt easier than explaining why I did not want anyone talking about it. I did not know it then, but my brother and sister had spent years quietly resenting me. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 34 years old, and for most of my life, people called me the favorite daughter. The title followed me everywhere. Relatives used it during family gatherings. Neighbors mentioned it when they visited our home. Teachers spoke about me as if I were an example that other children should follow. Over time, people repeated the idea so often that it stopped feeling like an opinion and started feeling like a fact. From the outside, the evidence seemed convincing. I was the first person in my family to graduate from university. I worked as a project coordinator for a healthcare company. My parents often asked for my advice before making important decisions. Whenever guests visited our home, stories about my achievements usually appeared before dessert reached the table. People saw the finished picture and assumed they understood how it was painted. They never saw what existed underneath. One of my earliest memories came from a school awards ceremony when I was 11 years old. I won first place in a regional writing competition, and my parents were thrilled. That evening, relatives filled our living room and congratulated me for hours. At first, I enjoyed the attention. Then I noticed Ethan sitting alone near the window. Earlier that week, he had scored the winning goal in an important soccer match. It should have been one of the biggest moments of his year. Yet nobody asked about it. Nobody mentioned it. Every conversation returned to my award. At 11, I thought he was simply quiet. Years later, I understood something different. He was hurt. Not because I succeeded, because nobody noticed that he had succeeded too. The memory stayed with me as I grew older. Another scene returned often when I thought about my childhood. I was 16 when Lily performed in a school music recital. She practiced for months and played beautifully. Afterward, several relatives congratulated her warmly. The praise lasted less than 5 minutes before someone asked whether I had chosen a university yet. I still remember Lily's expression. The excitement disappeared from her face almost instantly. At the time, I thought she was tired from performing. Now I knew better. She had learned the same lesson Ethan learned years earlier. In our family, achievements were rarely allowed to exist on their own. Somehow, everything became a comparison. The strange part was that I never wanted those comparisons. I loved my siblings. I admired them. If I could have redirected every conversation toward them, I would have done it. Unfortunately, children rarely control the stories adults tell. As the years passed, expectations followed me into every part of life. Teachers expected excellent grades. Relatives expected impressive accomplishments. My parents expected responsibility and maturity. Nobody sat me down and demanded perfection. Yet perfection slowly became the standard everyone assumed I could reach. At school, one teacher often discussed expectations during career planning sessions. She explained that expectations could motivate people when they felt realistic. However, expectations could also become heavy when a person felt responsible for meeting them all the time. I understood exactly what she meant. By 14, mistakes already felt dangerous. One afternoon, I brought home a report card with one grade that was slightly lower than usual. It was still a good result, yet my father studied the paper carefully before asking what had happened. He was not angry. He was not disappointed. The question itself was enough. For the first time, I realized people no longer expected me to do well. They expected me to excel. The difference changed everything. While Ethan and Lily were encouraged to improve, I felt responsible for maintaining an image that had already been created for me. By the time I entered university, everyone seemed convinced my future would unfold perfectly. The reality looked very different. I worked part-time at a bookstore while carrying a full academic schedule. Most weekends disappeared beneath assignments, presentations, and deadlines. While other students attended parties, I often sat alone in the library preparing for exams. During my second year, one professor frequently spoke about resilience. According to him, resilient people were not those who avoided difficulties. They were people who recovered from setbacks and continued moving forward. I admired that idea because it sounded strong and admirable. Unfortunately, I misunderstood it. I convinced myself that resilient people never asked for help. Whenever I felt exhausted, I worked harder. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I stayed silent. Whenever I struggled, I pretended everything was fine. That habit followed me long after graduation. Years later, I built a successful career and earned the respect of my colleagues. My parents celebrated every promotion, every achievement, and every milestone. Although I appreciated their support, something uncomfortable happened after each success. Nothing ever felt complete. Every accomplishment immediately became the starting point for the next expectation. When I earned a promotion, people asked what position I wanted next. When I bought my first apartment, relatives wondered when I would buy a larger one. Success felt less like a destination and more like a moving target that kept drifting farther away. Around that time, my manager asked me to mentor a new employee named Naomi. Unlike most professionals I knew, Naomi seemed completely comfortable admitting mistakes. She once sent an unfinished report to a client and openly discussed the error afterward. Instead of hiding her embarrassment, she focused on what she learned from the experience. I found her attitude fascinating. One afternoon, she told me a story about growing up as the youngest of 4 children. Everyone in her family excelled at something, and she spent years trying to be noticed. According to Naomi, people become happier when they stop competing with someone else's image and start focusing on their own growth. The comment stayed with me. At the time, I had no idea how important those words would become. A few months later, Ethan launched his own business. The first year was difficult. Several projects failed, and he lost money more than once. My parents supported him through every setback and reminded him that progress often requires mistakes. Watching those conversations stirred an uncomfortable question inside me. What would happen if I failed that publicly? Would people offer me the same patience? Or would they stare at me as if something had gone terribly wrong? The question followed me everywhere. Then my father's 60th birthday arrived. The house was filled with relatives, laughter, and old family stories. Everyone seemed relaxed. I spent most of the evening helping in the kitchen and making sure guests were comfortable. Near the end of the celebration, I walked toward the dining room carrying a stack of empty plates. As I approached the doorway, I heard Ethan mention my name. I slowed down without meaning to. A moment later, Lily joined the conversation. Neither of them knew I was standing nearby. Then Ethan said something that made me stop completely. He told a room full of relatives that being Claire Bennett was probably the easiest life in the family. The worst part was not hearing him say it. The worst part was realizing that nobody at the table seemed surprised. Before I share the rest of story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. I remained frozen beside the dining room doorway, holding a stack of empty plates while my heart pounded against my ribs. Part of me wanted to walk away and pretend I had never heard my name. Another part needed to know what my brother and sister truly thought of me. Ethan did not sound angry. That was what unsettled me most. His voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had believed the same thing for years. He told the relatives that life had always been easier for me. According to him, teachers admired me, family members celebrated me, and opportunities seemed to arrive naturally. He described me as someone who never had to fight for attention because attention was already waiting for me. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Nobody rushed to disagree. Then Lily joined the conversation. She admitted that growing up beside me had often felt exhausting. Every achievement she earned seemed to arrive with an invisible comparison. Whenever she accomplished something important, someone eventually mentioned my grades, my job, or my future plans. She said she spent years feeling as though she was competing against a version of me that nobody else could see. The words hit me harder than I expected. For most of my life, I believed my siblings viewed me as dependable and successful. I never imagined they saw me as a source of frustration. The conversation eventually moved on to other topics, but I could not forget what I had heard. That night, I returned to my apartment and sat awake long after midnight. I replayed memories from childhood and noticed details I had ignored before. The soccer match that nobody discussed, the music recital that became a conversation about university applications, the countless moments when attention shifted away from my siblings and back toward me. For years, I assumed we had shared the same childhood. Now I realized we had experienced completely different versions of it. The following week felt unusually heavy. I went to work, attended meetings, and completed projects, but part of my mind remained trapped in that dining room conversation. Naomi noticed the change immediately. She had become one of my closest friends over the past year, and she rarely ignored something when she sensed it mattered. During lunch, she asked whether everything was okay. For a moment, I considered giving the usual answer and changing the subject. Instead, I told her the truth. I described the birthday dinner, the conversation I overheard, and the resentment I never knew existed. When I finished speaking, Naomi remained quiet for several seconds. Then she shared something she had never told me before. When she was younger, her oldest sister had been considered the star of the family. She earned awards, scholarships, and praise everywhere she went. Naomi admitted that she spent years believing her sister had a perfect life. Years later, she discovered that her sister had struggled with anxiety and spent most of her teenage years terrified of disappointing everyone. The revelation changed the way Naomi viewed her childhood. She explained that people often compare their private struggles to someone else's public image. Because they cannot see what happens behind closed doors, they assume the other person's life is easier. Her words stayed with me. My siblings had seen my achievements. They had never seen the pressure attached to them. A few days later, my company announced a major restructuring project. Several departments would be reorganized, and new leadership positions would be created. The news immediately created tension throughout the office because nobody knew how the changes would affect their future. Uncertainty tends to make people uncomfortable. When outcomes are unclear, many individuals focus on risks rather than possibilities. I noticed that reaction in almost every conversation that week. To my surprise, senior management selected me to lead one of the new project teams. Coworkers congratulated me throughout the day. Normally, I would have appreciated the recognition. This time, I felt exhausted. The position came with longer hours, greater responsibility, and significantly more pressure. As everyone celebrated the promotion, I found myself wondering whether they would still envy it if they understood what it demanded. That evening, I visited my parents for dinner. My mother proudly mentioned the promotion before I even sat down. Within minutes, the conversation turned toward my career and future opportunities. For years, I accepted those discussions without questioning them. This time was different. I asked whether they had ever worried that I might fail. The question seemed to surprise both of them. My mother looked confused before answering. She said failure was never something she associated with me. She always assumed I would find a solution, regardless of how difficult the situation became. My father agreed. He explained that he trusted me because I had always appeared capable and dependable. Their answers revealed something important. They had never intended to create impossible expectations. They simply believed in me so completely that they stopped imagining any other outcome. As I drove home that night, I thought about how easily love can become pressure when it is expressed through expectations. People do not always realize the weight they place on someone they admire. A few days later, I made a decision. Instead of waiting for Ethan to contact me, I called him myself. I was tired of assumptions. I was tired of trying to understand our relationship through overheard conversations and old memories. When he answered, there was a brief silence before either of us spoke. Then I asked if he would meet me for coffee. He agreed immediately. That Saturday, we sat across from each other in a small cafe overlooking the river. The conversation began awkwardly. Neither of us seemed certain where to start. Eventually, I told him about the birthday dinner. I admitted that I had overheard everything. Ethan looked embarrassed for a moment, but he did not deny what he had said. Instead, he stared into his coffee cup and took a long breath. Then he revealed something that changed everything. Years earlier, he had been offered a scholarship to one of the most respected business programs in the country. He never accepted it, not because he lacked ability, not because he lacked ambition. He rejected it because he was tired of spending his life being compared to me. And as I listened to him explain why, I realized that the burden my siblings carried might have been just as heavy as my own. I stared at Ethan for several seconds, trying to process what he had just told me. The cafe remained busy around us, but the noise faded into the background. I could only think about the scholarship he had turned down, and the reason behind that decision. Ethan explained that receiving the offer should have been one of the happiest moments of his life. His teachers believed he had enormous potential. The program would have opened doors to opportunities he had dreamed about for years. Instead of feeling excited, he felt trapped. He told me that every achievement in his life eventually became part of a comparison. If he earned good grades, someone mentioned my grades. If he succeeded in sports, someone reminded him of my academic accomplishments. If he made plans for the future, relatives often discussed my future first. After years of hearing those comparisons, he stopped seeing success as something positive. Success became another opportunity to be measured against me. When the scholarship arrived, he imagined 4 more years of living under that pressure. He convinced himself that no matter how well he performed, People would continue comparing him to his older sister, so he walked away. Hearing that truth was painful. For years, I believed I was carrying the heaviest burden in the family. I thought nobody understood the pressure of being the child everyone expected to succeed. Sitting across from Ethan, I finally understood that comparison had hurt him just as deeply. The difference was that our struggles looked completely different from the outside. That afternoon, we spoke more honestly than we ever had before. I told him about the nights I spent awake worrying about disappointing people. I explained how every achievement seemed temporary because another expectation immediately replaced it. I admitted that I often felt exhausted by the image people had created around me. Ethan listened carefully. When I finished, he shook his head and smiled sadly. He said something I never forgot. He told me that he was not jealous because I succeeded. He was jealous because nobody ever allowed him to succeed without mentioning me. The sentence stayed with me long after we left the cafe. A few days later, Ethan and I invited Lily to dinner. At first, she seemed nervous. She suspected the conversation would involve old memories, and she was right. However, once we started speaking honestly, the tension slowly disappeared. Lily admitted that she spent years feeling invisible. She remembered bringing home awards, completing important projects, and reaching personal goals, only to watch conversations return to me within minutes. Over time, she stopped expecting recognition because she assumed it would never last. Listening to her was difficult. I cared deeply about my sister, yet I had never realized how isolated she often felt. At the same time, Lily confessed that she envied what appeared to be my confidence. She assumed I moved through life without fear because I rarely spoke about my struggles. That misunderstanding revealed another important truth. People often hide the parts of themselves they believe others will not understand. Over time, those hidden emotions create false impressions that can last for years. As our conversation continued, something remarkable happened. Nobody tried to prove they had suffered more. Nobody competed over whose experience was harder. Instead, we listened. Real listening requires patience. It means setting aside assumptions long enough to understand another person's perspective. That evening, empathy accomplished something that years of silence never could. For the first time in a very long time, we felt like siblings instead of rivals. A month later, our parents invited us to dinner. The atmosphere felt different from previous family gatherings. There was less performance and more honesty. During the meal, Ethan shared part of our recent conversations, and Lily described how constant comparisons had affected her confidence. My parents listened quietly. Neither of them became defensive. Instead, they seemed genuinely saddened. My father eventually admitted that he often used me as an example because he believed it would motivate my siblings. He wanted them to see what was possible through discipline and hard work. He never imagined those comparisons would create resentment. My mother shared a similar regret. She explained that she celebrated my achievements publicly because she was proud of me. Looking back, she realized that her good intentions sometimes came at the expense of her other children. The discussion did not erase the past. Some misunderstandings take time to heal. However, understanding replaced assumptions, and that changed everything. After dinner, my mother walked into the kitchen to pack leftovers. She opened a drawer and paused. Then she reached inside and pulled out something familiar. It was the award certificate I had hidden weeks earlier. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she handed it to me and smiled. She told me that I never needed to hide the things I worked hard to achieve. On the drive home, I kept thinking about those words. That night, I placed the certificate on a shelf in my apartment instead of hiding it away. For years, I believed every achievement carried a responsibility to remain perfect. I thought success was something I had to protect rather than appreciate. Now I understood something different. The certificate was not proof that I deserved more love than my siblings. It was not evidence that I was better than anyone else. It was simply the result of effort, persistence, and growth. As I looked at it one final time, I thought about the title that had followed me for most of my life. The favorite daughter. People attached countless meanings to those words. Some saw privilege, others saw pressure. The truth was more complicated than either version. I was never the favorite daughter. I was simply a daughter trying to meet expectations, while my brother and sister were trying to escape them. Once we finally understood that, we stopped competing with one another's stories, and that understanding became far more valuable than any award I had ever received. If you liked this story, please like, comment, and share. More simple and emotional stories are coming soon.